Jesus took with him Peter, James, and his brother John, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While Peter was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Christ. Please be seated. We hear the phrase mountaintop experience. Has anybody ever heard that phrase before? Has anybody ever experienced a mountaintop experience? I remember when we were going through Koinonia, and if you've never been through Koinonia or Crucio, it's something very, very wonderful to be a part of. And I remember at the closing that all of the folks who spoke there, they talked about a mountaintop experience. It was a time when they felt closer to God than any other time in their life. And spiritually, that's what some people look forward to. They think that that is something they must attain, being on that mountaintop with God. Now this morning we hear a story about 3 disciples who Jesus picks to go on the mountaintop. And of course, me being the perpetual 3-year-old, I have to ask why. Why 3? There were 12, weren't there? Why 3? Could it be that these were the best of the best? These were the guys that were the graduate level students, and Jesus wanted to take them up for some special teaching? Or were these guys the dunces, the guys that sit in the back row, the ones who come in with their baseball hats pulled down over their eyes, hoping not to get picked on? We don't know. All we know is that Jesus looked at Peter, James, and John and said, "You 3 volunteered, come with me." And so they followed. They went up this mountain. And when they got to the top of the mountain, they didn't know what to expect. They didn't know if this was going to be extracurricular work. They didn't know if there was going to be some people up there that needed healing or what may happen. They couldn't fathom what was to happen to them. When they got to the top of the mountain, Jesus was transfigured. Now, in our gospel for today, it says that not only his clothes, but his face shone like the radiance of the sun. One of the other gospel writers say that it was like lightning. It was so bright. The other gospel writer says it was as if somebody had bleached his clothes white, but whiter than anything you've ever seen. And if that wasn't enough, there was Elijah and Moses standing there, talking with Jesus. How did they know? How did they know it was Moses and Elijah? Moses had died and was buried 1,400 years before this transfiguration happened. Elijah was taken up in a chariot to heaven 850 years before that time. How did they know? Did they have to wear those stupid little name tags we have to wear at every function? Hi, I'm Ron. I have this feeling that when we're in the presence of God, we won't have to ask many questions. God is already going to reveal to us that which he needs us to know. And I believe that's what happened to Peter, James, and John. They just knew that this was Moses and this was Elijah. Now we have to understand a couple things about this scene going on, and we have to understand why it's important, not only for the disciples, but it's important for us as well. First of all, Jesus being transfigured. Why is that such a big deal? Well, the disciples had been with Jesus for a number of years, and through those years, they had witnessed Jesus in action. They had seen him change water into wine. They had seen him heal those people who were lame, those who were blind, those who could not hear. He had cleansed and healed the lepers. He had walked on water. He had stilled the storms, and he had raised the dead. All of these actions they had witnessed. But now, on that mountain, they got to see the glory of God from within. It was not by his action that this happened. It was by their sight that they got to see. That God's glory shone who he truly was. And that is important. They had to truly know in their hearts and in their minds and in their very fiber that this was God. They also had to know truly that this was Moses and Elijah. Now we know in the Old Testament that Moses was the one that went up Mount Sinai, and we heard it in our first lesson today. And the reason he went up there is so that he could bring the laws down to his people, the Ten Commandments. And not only did he have the Ten Commandments to share with all of God's people, but they attribute the first 5 books of the Bible, what we know as the Torah, the laws of God, to Moses. So Moses represents the law. Elijah, of course, is known as the greatest of all prophets. Elijah, too, had to climb a mountain. You see, when he was being persecuted by Jezebel and all others, he climbed up the Mount Horeb, and he then tried to hide out. And God, in a whisper, said to him, "Do not be afraid. I got this." And it soon came to be that God indeed did have this. And so we have the law and the prophets standing with Jesus. Now, didn't we hear a week or so ago that Jesus said that he came not to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them? And there they are, standing with him, so that they might know that his word was true. That he came not to abolish either what Moses or Elijah had prophesied, but rather he came to fulfill all that they had said. Now, of course, they're talking, and what are they talking about? Well, they're talking about something that the disciples don't want to hear. How do we know this? Because Peter gets excited. And Peter has this bad habit of whenever something's going on, he needs to put his 2 cents in. And so as Elijah and Moses and Jesus are talking, it's a conversation the disciples really don't want to hear. So Peter then says, "Hey, I got an idea. How about if I build 3 dwellings? One for you, Jesus, one for Elijah, one for Moses. Let's hang out here for a while. As a matter of fact, let's stay here forever. Because this is really good." You see, these 3 disciples were having that mountaintop experience. They were up there. They knew they were face to face with God. They were there with Moses and Elijah. Why would they want to leave? And let's think about this. Would we want to leave either? When we come face to face with God, would we want to leave? And so, of course, Peter wanted to stay. And all he could think about was putting up 3 shelters. Like God needs a shelter. And yet, that's all he could come up with. That's all he knew what to say. But I think it's pretty funny if you read it the way, at least I read it this morning. is that while Peter is still talking, a cloud comes over them all, and a voice from the cloud says something. I'd like to translate it for you. Peter, shut up. That's the short take. A voice from the cloud says, "This is my Son, my beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." Let's paraphrase that again. Peter, James, and John. This is the Son of God. I can't make it any clearer to you. He's glowing in the dark. Moses and Elijah are here, the law and the prophets. And now I'm telling you, this is my Son. Believe in him. But most importantly, listen to him. They're so afraid, they're face down in the dirt right now. They're afraid because they know what they have learned from the Old Testament, that if you come face to face with God, you must surely die. And so they are face down. They are afraid. Yeah, they crossed that line. They are so afraid that God is going to do them in. And the next thing they know, there's the voice of Jesus. But before he even says a word, he reaches down and touches them to let them know it's okay. To let them know, do not be afraid. Come, follow me. And he leads them down that mountain. He leads them into the valley. In fact, Jesus will lead them into the valley of the shadow of death, because that's where Jesus knows he has to go. That is the discussion that Jesus and Moses and Elijah were having that the disciples did not want to hear. How do we know that? Well, just one chapter earlier, when Jesus was walking along with the disciples, Jesus says to his class there, "Who do you say that I am?" And of course, Peter, he has to jump up and down until Jesus calls on him. And Peter says, "You are the anointed of God. You are the Messiah. You are the Son of God." And Jesus says, "You're right. But you didn't know that on your own. In fact, the only way you could have known that is from God himself." And then, after this proclamation of faith, Jesus then reveals what must happen. That he must go to Jerusalem, and there he will be persecuted, there he will be beaten, there he will be hung on a cross, and there he will die. And Peter says, "Not happening. Not if I'm around." He says, "Jesus, I forbid it." Of course, Jesus just looked down and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You don't know what you're talking about. You're thinking, Peter, of earthly things. You're thinking about earthly glory. You're thinking about earthly power. But I am the Son of God. You just said that. And so you should be thinking about heavenly things. You should be thinking about what it is that God had intended for all of his creation. And that is that he wanted to redeem his creation. And the only way to do that is with the blood of the Lamb. Not in the way of the Exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, where you took the unblemished lamb from the herd and then took the blood of that lamb and smeared it along the fence or the doorway. But rather this would be the Lamb of God. And that it would be his blood that would cleanse us all. You see, that's the conversation that was going on that mountain. That's the conversation Peter and the disciples didn't want to hear. They had their own thoughts on what it was to be a Messiah, what it was to be a king. They wanted someone who was going to ride into town, get rid of the Romans, get rid of the Pharisees, get rid of all the people that were standing against them. And then Jesus would be put on he would be on an earthly throne, and people would then worship him. And yet Jesus said, that's not the way it's going to happen. In fact, Peter, I don't want you to speak of this again. until after the Son of Man has risen. You notice that's the only time Peter didn't say anything? He knew to shut up. God had just told him to listen. And for the first time, he did just that. But did he really listen? Did those disciples who went up there truly listen? And the answer is no. And how do we know that? After Jesus was persecuted, after he was beaten, after he was hung on the cross, what did his disciples do? They ran. And not only did they run, but they locked themselves in the upper room for fear of the Jews. If they had listened, if they had truly listened, they would have known all that Jesus had foretold would come true. That he would die, but he would be raised again. They had nothing to fear. Jesus told them. And yet, they would not listen. Jesus asks us to listen as well. That each time we gather here, we listen to his word. We listen to his word in our readings. We hear his word in our hymns. Hopefully we hear his words in our sermons. And sometimes, hopefully, we hear his words coming from one another. That we listen and we believe. And not only that, but here in this place, we get to experience that touch that those disciples felt when Jesus reached out and said, "It's going to be okay. Don't be afraid." That when we gather here at this altar, we will receive the body and blood of Jesus Christ. He will once again touch our lives. And once again, we will consume that body and blood. And once again, God will be within us. And if we believe, then we know we don't have to fear anything. That we know where we are going. That we understand that God is thinking about the long game and not just the short game. And that no matter what happens here on earth, God is with us. Did he not tell us that wherever two or more are gathered in my name, there I shall be? Did God not say that he would be with us even until the end of days? Well, if we listen, we would know. And in knowing, we can live. We can trust. We know the end of the story. That one day, as we will hear on Wednesday, that we are dust, and to dust we shall return. And yet we do not fear. For we know that just as Jesus was raised from the dead by God the Father, we too will be raised from the dead. And on the judgment day we will stand before God. But we do not need to be afraid, because Jesus will stand with us. And once again we will feel that touch upon us. And he will say, "My brother, my sister, I have paid the price for you. Follow me now into my Father's kingdom." Do not be afraid. Listen. I pray that not only through this season of Lent that is coming up, not just on Ash Wednesday, not through Lent itself, but every day for the rest of your lives, we might listen. And in listening, we might believe. And in believing, we might know that we have eternal life. And that we can encourage others to do the same. To hear the Word of God. To know his peace. To know his grace. To know that even though we may not experience that mountaintop, we can experience the presence of God wherever we are, in whatever circumstance we find ourselves, that God is there, and that you are the beloved of God. Amen.
Amen.